So today we're going to take a hard look at progressive web applications. We're going to, it's a pity that the other progressive web application workshop was canceled, but we will give you that fix that you've been craving. So just stick with us, we'll get you through this. And before we sort of start talking about who we are, I just wanted to show you a little bit of the structure of how our talk is gonna go. So for example, we're gonna get into a background on who we are as people, why we decided to implement PWAs when they're technically not production ready, and sort of where we're coming from on this topic. What you should know about PWAs. Also, I can't really see the chat at the moment. So if anything is going on that's wrong, just I won't know until the end of the chat. So bear with me. And then we're gonna talk about the two main structures of what you need to have a PWA. We're gonna talk about the manifest, what it is, the benefits and caveats of it, and our experience implementing a manifest. And then we'll talk about the second important structure, which is the service worker. And we'll talk as well about what it is, the benefits and caveats, and our experience implementing it. And I'm looking away because I have a second screen here. And at the end, we're gonna wrap it up, and then I'll disseminate some links and other goodies for the audience members. So please stick around till the end, and also feel free to ask us questions at the end, and throw us some questions in the Slack too. So before we kind of get into it, oh, that's my mouse. Brittany wanted to say a couple words.
Yeah, so I think we just wanted to start off by saying thank you to the FrontConf team. Obviously, everybody's aware that the last few weeks have been a little intense and a lot crazy, but the organizers have handled every concern and issue with grace. And I know that Maya and I are so grateful that we can still participate in the event despite not technically being at the event. So thank you.
Yeah, so a little bit about who we are. So my name is Filipp, that's my Slavic name, don't pay it any attention. I'm a lead full stack developer, so anytime code kind of goes wrong, it's my responsibility, and please help me. And I'm also an open source enthusiast, and technically I'm into the back end, but don't tell anybody. And then this is
Brittany. So I'm an Indigenous undergraduate aerospace engineering student, and I'm also a research analyst. So Maya and I work together at the Wapatah Center for Indigenous Visual Knowledge, which is a research center at OCAD University, and we're both based out of Toronto, Canada. So we're both working on the virtual platform for Indigenous Art, or the VPIA, which is a research project that is funded by the Canada Council of the Arts. So the VPIA is an open source digital platform that our team is building in an effort to create conversations around museum records. And that's specifically museum records of Indigenous objects that have European representation. So on the next slide here, you can see our team that is working on the VPIA. So our Tier 1 Canada Research Chair and Principal Investigator, Dr. Gerald McMaster, our postdoc, Michael Rattray, our project manager, Natalia, our UX and graphic designers, Rezvan and Mariah, and also our front-end developer, Yi. Alrighty, so considering the main goal of the platform is to bring otherwise normally inaccessible objects to the communities that they came from in a safe and digital space, we didn't just need to consider who the end users of the VPIA were, but also where they were. And in our initial data set, we pulled from over 20 institutions around the world. The objects that we were primarily looking at were from Indigenous communities in North America. So the map that you can see here is indicating how much of the general population per region is actually Indigenous in North America. I mostly just want to highlight the purplish fuchsia color, I guess it's purple, that indicates an Indigenous population of 25% or more. And as you can see, it's pretty much limited to the Canadian Arctic and shows the highest density of Indigenous people. So that's actually two provinces there. The first one on the left is the Northwest Territories, which I believe has an Indigenous population of about 50%. And then the second larger one on the right, which is of particular interest to me, is Nunavut. So that's where my mother's family is from. And it's actually the only Indigenous governed province in Canada. And it has an Indigenous population of more than 85%. So the thing is that up north, the majority of the bandwidth is first sourced to the government, then to the businesses, and then whatever little remains essentially just trickles down into the households. So they've got really bad internet connection. And this is what sparked our initial conversations around internet connectivity issues in remote communities like the ones that my family is from. But this isn't really an uncommon issue and definitely isn't restricted to our target audience either. So that in particular is what brought the question, how do we deliver the VPIA to Indigenous communities in a way that is reliable regardless of their internet connection? And that's why our development team turned to progressive web applications.
Exactly, and before I came onto this project, I worked with European developers actually out in Denmark, trying to develop a PWA. And when I came to this project and started learning more about our target end users, I realized that this is, you know, although it's not production ready, this is something that I think needs to happen to support our end users who may not have great internet connection. So before we sort of jump into it, I do want to say that I hate the word progressive web applications. I know that naming things are really hard. That's like one of the tenements of development. But I think that it's a little bit of a misnomer, but I understand like why this was so difficult to explain. But for the majority of this, for the remainder of this talk, I'm just gonna say PWAs or PWAs or whatever, you know, is catchier to the audience. And because of the way that it was named, our teams, both of my teams kind of initially approached this as a major architectural change. So, right, we had multi-page application design, and then we kind of went into single-page application design, and now we've got thousands of JavaScript frameworks to fight over about. And clearly, right, now it's progressive web applications. And because it's an architectural change, well, my God, why didn't my boss just let me build it from scratch? And oh God, I have to migrate the entire code base, and this is gonna be such a pain. That is false. The big secret, and please don't tell anyone, but please tell everybody. The secret truth about PWAs is that they are easy. So you do not need to change your code base. You literally drop in 2 files. I'll show you in a second the only code that you have to modify. You do not have to touch anything. It is really easy. You do not have to waste your time on it. But it took us some time to realize it because if you know the structure, it's easy. And if you wait until the end of this presentation, I can disseminate a boilerplate to the audience. So, and feel free to go and roast it as well. I might have missed some stuff, but hopefully this will be a good sort of landing point if you want to incorporate PWAs into your projects. So, for example, I just want to show you exactly the code that you actually changed. So this is your index.html. Keep in mind that this presentation is kind of focused more on single-page applications, but this can be ported to multi-page applications as well. So whatever your index.html is, you literally drop in this link to your manifest, which is a separate file. And then you have this generic kind of loader that you just listen for load, and then you register this serviceworker.js file. And literally, whatever you change in the service worker, just leave it in that file. And this is all you change. This is all you have to do. And I'll tell you exactly, we'll tell you along the way how much benefit you get from this. So Brittany will now outline just visually what the structure is going to look like.
Okay, so what is the PWA? We can essentially narrow it down to the two key structures that we mentioned. The first being the manifest, which gives the website the visual aspect of an app, and the service worker, which allows your website or web app to function offline.
Exactly. And before we sort of really jump in, before you implement a PWA, keep in mind the W3C status. So for both of these APIs, they are web standards. They're part of the web API standards. However, they are both in working drafts, so they are subject to change. I don't foresee it being completely stricken off because of, we'll talk about it more, just how many benefits you get from this. But just keep that in mind. We have an experimental research project, which is why we're more open to using this in production. But keep it in mind when you are developing your projects with PWAs. And do I need to have it actually be a PWA? You need both of those standards to be considered a PWA. But if you wanted just a service worker, you could just have the service worker. If you want the manifesto, you need to have a service worker or else this is not going to work. So just keep that in mind. And again, I just want to reiterate this point. You do not have to build this from scratch. This is not an architectural change. The best thing you can do is just have your website stable or even unstable like ours is and just drop it in as an add-on. So yeah, so keep that in mind moving forward. So now I'm going to pass it on to Brittany to tell us a little bit about the manifest.
Okay, so the manifest. It's essentially just a JSON file, which allows your website to be downloadable as a standalone application. So with that in mind, we should consider what do we need for a standalone app. So here you can see the basic icon that we used for the VPIA. And the main things to note here is that it consists of the logo and the title. And this is what differentiates the VPIA app from what you might open in your web browser. And this difference is actually really important considering mobile users love mobile apps. So when we're looking at our target end users, where most of them have some sort of mobile device, whether that's a cell phone or a tablet, they are more likely to engage and revisit the VPIA, considering it now looks like something that they could download from the App Store. And then on this next slide here, we show the proper code for a manifest, that being manifest.webmanifest. Considering the fact that the manifest is a JSON file, like I said before, I know that our development team prefers to have it written as manifest.json, but the standard recommendation is to write it as manifest.webmanifest, which again is why it's shown like that here. So I think I just want to point out that we have our key value pair here. So the key being the icon or logo used. In our case, it's an icon, and the value being the name or title. And for us, we use the short name, the VPIA.
And I just want to bring quickly attention to this one, and that's off. But it is the display key. So what this does is there's a few values to this. Standalone is the one that's kind of recommended because, for example, if you do download it to your mobile, this allows you to see the battery indicators and the time just as an actual like mobile app does. But you can change this to full screen to get rid of that as well. Or you can just leave it blank and essentially it defaults to a bookmark instead. So we'll move on to the benefits of having this manifest.
Okay, so the most important thing to reiterate, once again, is just how easy and little work it takes to implement. So a PWA at its core is a web application that is considered progressive, but maybe more importantly, it's one that is responsive. So as long as you make your web application or website responsive for mobile browsers, then it's going to perform the same way that a native app would, but now you don't have to worry about implementing it. And if you are looking for native capabilities that are beyond what browsers allow, at least in terms of hardware device access, hardware access, you can use programming like Swift or Java, which is supported by Apple and Android. And if you absolutely needed to have an APK or IPA file, which I know that Maya is going to speak more to in a moment, you can still publish PWAs onto any of the app stores without having to change your code accordingly.
Yeah, so I just want to reiterate that this means you do not need to support a separate code base. It really depends on what you need a mobile app for. But technically, you can forego these hybrid like Cordova and React Native here and just add it in later as a PWA. If you are like, if you're making a video game, obviously you would probably want to use Java or Swift. And then I put in Electron here because there's actually something called desktop PWAs. And at this point, it's not really, I'll talk more about it, but potentially as it goes on, this may also usurp your Electron use. So you may not have to bundle all of that Chrome engine. So let's continue on.
And then, I mean, benefit number 2 is since you don't have to update a separate code base anymore, there's no longer a delay to release. So each time you update your website, there is no mobile app counterpart that you then need to update. Your web app is going to update automatically as long as there is an internet connection. And the added benefit to that is that you're no longer subject to mobile app stores like Google Play or Apple, which in turn means that you aren't subject to US expectations. So with the VPIA, for example, a lot of the objects that are now held by institutions make a profit, whether it's in knowledge or monetary value, and oftentimes it can be at the expense of the indigenous communities that they were taken from. So if the powers that be don't like this idea of digital repatriation that the VPIA is going to offer, and then therefore Google doesn't like it either, then at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because we used a web application and we didn't need to post it onto the Google Play Store.
Yeah, and I know this kind of sounds subversive, but like the non-subversive one is that a lot of indigenous people, they prefer to use mobile phones. It's hard to get access to a desktop. So this also makes it easier for people to download this. And I should say on top of that subversive previous comment is that when I was actually out in Denmark, you wouldn't really think that US expectations would have a huge effect, but maybe Europeans are more aware that there's a lot of cultural differences even in like a short amount of space. And like in Denmark, for example, there was an amusement park that kind of had a character that was smoking, and that was fine by Danish standards to show to kids, but that was deemed inappropriate by Google and Apple. And you'd think that Apple would be the one that wouldn't put back the app, but really it was actually Google Play. Sorry, Benedict, but there's, and we can see an even more insidious example, like with the Hong Kong app that was taken down from the Apple Store. That wasn't like violating any laws, but it did make Apple stakeholders not happy, so they took it down. So let's move on to the more fun part, which is how many caveats there are and some of the issues with the manifest. So one big thing is that there's actually no basic common UI. And what do I mean by this? The reason why you need a service worker is that the service worker with the manifest would check if your website is ready and PWA ready. So it would send something called a before install prompt to your browser engine. And then every single browser kind of handles that default behavior differently to show the user that you can download your website. So for example, this, I don't remember where this is from. I think this is Samsung Internet on mobile. And you can see this like really tiny download thing where like you don't know if you're downloading the site or if you're it's a downloads folder. This is Firefox on Android, and you can see the little house here, which is like, are you just adding it to your main page, or are you actually downloading it, which is what you're supposed to be seeing. This one is the better UI that I've seen, which is the one on most Chromium devices. This is on Brave. And you can see it's add to home screen, but this also doesn't really make sense because that sounds more like a bookmark than a standalone application. It might make more sense to just say download VPIA to your phone. And then this is my favorite. This is on Chrome. This is a desktop PWA, so Chrome on desktop, and you can see this tiny, tiny plus that you cannot tell that you can actually install this app. And Apple Safari, from my knowledge, does not even have a banner. You have to go into the settings and then add to home screen to do this. And then Firefox desktop at this point does not support desktop PWAs. I was trying to read through their complaints on the standards, and I'm not exactly sure why they have a problem with before install prompt, because they did add it to Firefox Android. So you can see that there's really like no basic default behavior. So one solution could be, and these are actually called add to home screen or A2HS. And one solution could be to add a custom A2HS banners. And these images are like the UI that you would install. So this would be the same on every single like browser. And in my experience, like this was dug from the depths of the web. So, and I have been unable to find an example. So if you guys do drop in an example, that would be amazing. Anyways, we still haven't implemented it, but you can keep track of our progress on the GitHub if you want to. And then the second caveat is a pretty big one. So technically, the way that most of these browsers treat this download function is as if it's kind of like you downloaded the website and then you remove the browser, the browser UI around it. So it's actually like a shell, but technically it's still your browser. So it's very confusing. So technically these are not actually APK or IPA files when you install a PWA. The only subversion of this is actually Chrome on Android, which uses something called Web APK, and that actually downloads and installs your app as if it's an actual mobile app. So if you want to uninstall it, you have to go into the app setting and forcibly uninstall it. And you can actually, I reverse engineered this, and you actually get an APK file from this for your website. So a little bit, you can see that it's kind of all over the place with how everyone's handling it, but I'm hoping that this will be resolved in the future. So now we're going to jump into service worker, and I'll let Brittany take it from here.
Okay, so before we actually jump into service workers, we should identify the differences between web worker and service worker API. So the web worker is a web standard that supports multi-processing, whereas the service worker is essentially a mini server or proxy server that doesn't influence the DOM and intercepts HTTP requests as a means to handle storage. And that is how you get that offline experience.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, the web worker essentially is just like a background event that you would use to make sure that it's not blocking your rendering process on your website versus service worker. Obviously, as Brittany says, it is a kind of like a proxy server. And how this kind of plays out, if you want to visualize it, is let's say your user visits your page, and then every time your user visits that page, right, it requests a response from the network of that page. And even like every time you go there, it constantly does this request, right? So what a service worker can do is intercept that response and actually save a copy to a cache in cache storage. And essentially the next time the person comes, instead of you automatically being requesting the network for that page, the service worker can stop you right there and redirect you to the cache. So that's where you kind of get that infamous, oh, by adopting PWAs, we had this huge performance boost. So this is coming from the service worker. And again, I'd like to reiterate that you can just have a service worker without a manifest. So now we're gonna get into the benefits of the service worker.
Okay, so one of the key benefits that I wanted to talk about is the performance increase that's seen by websites that use a service worker. So in this slide here, we're looking at companies like Uber, Trivago, and Tinder. But of course, anyone that makes use of a service worker won't just see an increase in performance, but also an increase in engagement. And moving on to the next benefit, and probably the most important benefit, at least in terms of the VPIA, is that now your website has offline capability. So in instances like my family up north, as long as they have visited the website before, they no longer rely on their subpar internet service. So this way users can continue to engage and revisit with the VPIA or any website that uses a service worker. But now they just don't have to worry about losing access to it each time the Wi-Fi signal drops.
Exactly. However, there are caveats to this amazing, piece of web API technology, which is the implementation is up to you. So if you look at examples across the web, you will find everybody has a different implementation of a service worker. Mozilla has their own implementation of a service worker. ViewPress has their own. Create React App has their own. And technically, you would have to be the one to handle, okay, when do I cache? When do I request from network? When do I expire the data? So, and there's so many different approaches also just in caching that it can get overwhelming. So I'd like to propose that unless you have a very specific use case of when you want this network request to happen, or you want something extremely streamlined for performance sake, especially if you have like if you have Chrome, you have a large project that you need to worry about this, I would suggest to nix all this. This is taken from the Google. Google has been heavily invested in the development of the PWA infrastructure. And actually they have their own library, which I actually recommend using, which is Workbox. And they actually don't have all of these cache approaches, but you can write your own as well. So I can show you, this is kind of like our blood, sweat, and tears. The service worker JS, like you simply import the script, right? The workbox. And then you have, I'm not going to get into this, but this is to pre-cache your routes. So if you have a page that's like an about page or some other like standalone page, you would pre-cache it. And then when the user's offline, it would still like return a 200 okay. And then this one, I love this little thing. It's a regex checking if the response was a JavaScript file or a CSS file. You can keep adding whatever like thing you need. And you can split this down further. But if it detects that, you create a strategy. So here you can see it's network first strategy. And then you just give it a name and that's it. And of course, the naming stuff, as developers, that's the hardest thing. But everything else here is easy. So I just wanted to bring up a real quick point about Create React App. As I mentioned before, they have their own service worker implementation. And in our case, in both cases, in my the first project in Denmark, we use Create React App. And the problem with the service worker there is that it's just cache first, meaning that it fetches from the cache and then falls back to network. The problem with that is, and they recommend just using that for images or something that doesn't update a lot. The problem with that is that you have to depend on your users to understand that you have to delete your cache, and you don't have a way to do this programmatically because obviously it's a security hazard, or you would have to tell your users Control F5. This is more for single page applications. This doesn't really work very well. And in our experience, like we had a lot of times where as development progresses and we have a PWA, this started interfering with our work. So we would have to constantly like open up a new tab, and it was very frustrating, especially if you're doing hot reloading or anything like that. So please keep this in mind. It may work for your multi-page stuff, but we only use cache first for like Google fonts. That's all we use. And that's me going matrix here, so sorry about that. And then this one I thought would help us out in the workbox as well. They have something called stale while revalidate. So you fetch first from cache and then you check periodically on the network. The problem with this one is that unless you reload at any point, it does not actually send a request to check up on the network. You could potentially modify this behavior we didn't bother with it. But what we found was that if you reload a component, right, it only reloads the component. It doesn't actually reload the page. You have to reload it enough that it bounces away from, like, it disappears for a second, comes back, and then it's updated with the changes. So this was also a problem for us during development. And what we found worked best was a network first approach. So you just always fetch from network, and this works if you reload a component, it will do a request to network. And then if there's no network, like up in the north, you just fall back to cache, and it, you know, you'd think you'd lose performance on this, and we have not lost performance on this. So yeah, we're happy with this approach. And just sort of to wrap up, I hope that there were some useful tips that we gave today. I just wanted to reiterate that this is really simple to add. It saves you time, it gives you better performance. And don't forget, actually, like, especially in North America, there's a lot of people that don't have the access to great internet, and we don't even have as great internet as our European counterparts. But this just makes the web more reliable, and I think that this is a really powerful tool to use. And I also wanted to point out that, like, all of these standards are up on the GitHub, and I noticed that there's actually not that much input from developers. It's a lot of it is companies. And I think that we as developers should probably have more of a say in how these technologies play out. And that's kind of it for us, but we'll pass on this boilerplate. I'll throw it into our Slack channel. If you're interested, you can go and, like, complain, hey, you missed this, Maya, how dare you. So that's our boilerplate there. And I'll link to the Slack as well, the slides, sorry. And then if you're interested in the VPIA as well, like, drop us an email or, like, ask us some questions, that's fine. And yeah, that's basically it. And we'll take questions as well.